There are moments in life when pain does not knock. It enters uninvited, like a storm breaching the walls of a fragile home. You stand there, soaked not only in the rain that falls from the sky, but in the realization that the people you thought would cover you in your hour of need have vanished. Their absence is louder than any thunder, and their silence more piercing than the wind. They hurt you when you were at your lowest, and worse than the wound itself was the truth that they left you there, bleeding alone. It wasn't a stranger who broke your trust. It wasn't someone distant whose betrayal you could dismiss. It was the very ones you counted on. Those whose names you whispered in prayers and whose hands you would have held through fire. It was the ones who said they'd never leave. The ones who promised to understand, to stay, to love you through it all. But when your soul was most fragile, when your heart barely held together by threads of quiet hope, they turned their back and left, not with a fight, not with an explanation, but with coldness. And that is what stings the deepest. Not the betrayal itself, but the ease with which they walked away. How do you describe the ache of crying into your pillow, hoping for one message that never came? How do you articulate the shivering silence that followed after your world had fallen apart and not a single soul reached out their hand? You begin to question your worth. You replay your steps, wondering if maybe you expected too much, loved too deeply, cared too honestly. You ask yourself if your presence meant anything at all, and those questions echo in the silence they left behind. But there is a mystery to heartbreak. Something divine happens when a soul is shattered. For in the very moment you feel most abandoned, a presence arrives, not with words, but with warmth. It doesn't knock loudly, it doesn't scream for your attention. It comes like a whisper, a gentle nudge in the deepest parts of your being. God. He doesn't always appear as lightning or earthquake. No, more often he comes as comfort when the world forgets. He appears in the stillness when no one texts, when no one calls, when the crowd walks past you. That's when he steps in, not as a last resort, but as the only one who truly saw the cracks in your spirit and decided to sit with you, even in your mess. He left you, but God arrived. They forgot your worth, but he reminded you with every heartbeat that you are still his beloved. When you couldn't carry your burdens anymore, he didn't tell you to be strong. He carried them with you. When you no longer had words for prayer, he listened to your silence and understood every tear that fell. He became your strength when your bones were weak, your peace when your mind was chaos, your friend when loneliness wrapped itself around your chest like a vice. In those darkest hours, when you were tempted to believe no one cared, God was the one kneeling beside you, not in pity, but in promise, a promise that he would be what they refused to be. Not just a healer of wounds, but the presence that would never leave when the bleeding started again. And here's the paradox of it all. Those who left you did not win. Though they thought their exit would crush you, it became the very space God used to draw closer. Their absence made room for his presence. Their silence gave way to his voice. And their betrayal opened the door for a love that doesn't lie, doesn't leave, and doesn't falter when the storms rage. So don't despise the moment they left. Don't curse the empty room, the unanswered call, the birthday no one remembered, the cries that went unheard, because while they were leaving you behind, God was preparing to meet you there. And what they gave up, he saw as treasure. He saw you as a burden. God saw you as his child. They saw your weakness. God saw the space where his strength could live. They saw the tears. God saw the seeds of your future. They let go when they saw no value in staying. But God stayed because he always saw value in you. So now we begin the journey, not of revenge, not of bitterness, not of longing for them to come back, but of recognizing that when they left, they only made room for the one who was never going to walk away. And that is where true healing begins. There's something holy about loneliness when it is touched by divine hands, the kind of loneliness that isn't just physical but spiritual. When you're in a room full of people and still feel unseen, when your own voice echoes back to you because no one listens deeply enough to hear the pain behind your words, that sacred space where others fled is where God sets up camp, not to observe from a distance, but to dwell beside you, within you, and around you. His presence does not require applause or spotlight. He comes for hearts that are trembling in the dark, not those basking in artificial light. Sometimes God lets people leave, not to punish you, but to protect you, because their presence was blocking your perception of His. Their loyalty was conditional, their love temporary, their support only as deep as convenience allowed. And though it felt like devastation when they left, it was divine orchestration, a removal, yes, but also a replacement. He removed what you thought you needed and gave you what you actually couldn't live without, Himself. He allowed you to taste betrayal so that you'd crave truth. He let you feel abandonment so that you would recognize perfect companionship. He allowed the wound to open wide so that He could pour into it a healing that would change not only your heart, but your entire identity. You didn't just lose people, you lost illusions. You didn't just face heartbreak, you faced a holy breaking that would make room for truth to be planted. God doesn't mend us with bandages of false hope. He reshapes us. He doesn't simply cover the pain, He transforms it. He walks you back to the places where you were dropped, not so that you will live in regret, but so that you will see how He never dropped you. He never left. He was the one who caught you the moment they let go. And if you listen carefully, if you dare sit in the silence instead of rushing to fill it with noise, you'll hear His voice not as a thunderous command, but as a tender whisper. I was there. When your voice broke from crying, He was there. When your hands trembled reaching for someone who never came, He was there. When you sat on the floor wondering if you mattered to anyone, He was sitting beside you, whispering that you've always mattered to Him. You see, there's something extraordinary that happens when God becomes your everything. When people leave and the applause dies down, when the friendships fade and the calls stop coming, that's when you truly discover the intimacy of walking with a God who doesn't play games with your heart. He doesn't ghost you. He doesn't get tired of you. He doesn't say, I'm too busy. He listens to your ramblings. He sits with you in confusion. He even lets you be angry and still doesn't walk away. And what's more beautiful is this. He doesn't just show up. He stays. He doesn't require you to be perfect for Him to remain. He doesn't demand a performance for Him to listen. He doesn't walk out when your faith wavers or when your prayers grow weak. His love is not seasonal, it's eternal. They walked away when you were broken, but God was drawn to your brokenness. They were uncomfortable with your pain, but God found sacredness in it. They judged you in your weakness, but God chose you despite it. You may have felt discarded, rejected, forgotten, but you are not forgotten in the eyes of heaven. In fact, the very moment you felt most invisible to others, you were most visible to God. He saw not just what was done to you, but what would be born out of it. He saw the healing that would follow the hurt, the strength that would rise out of your surrender, the grace that would flood the space where betrayal once stood. What they took from you, God is about to restore, not in the same way, but in a far better form. What they shattered, he will rebuild, not to make it what it was, but to make it what it was always meant to be. For you are not just a survivor of abandonment, you are the beloved of the one who never leaves. And that, my friend, is where true restoration begins. The pain they left you in, raw, deep, and confusing, was not the end of your story. It was the middle, the valley, the shadow. And though it seemed like you were alone there, heaven was scripting redemption with every silent second you endured. God was not watching from afar. He was not detached, uncaring, or testing you for entertainment. No, he was close, so close that if your heart had been still enough, you would have felt his breath on your... The same God who numbered every hair on your head was tracing the lines of every hurt with tender care. Because that moment of being left, of being forgotten, was actually a divine appointment, not for punishment, but for preparation. For the truth is this, there are some lessons about God's nature that cannot be learned on the mountaintop. They are only discovered in the valley. Only when everyone walks away do you finally realize who was holding you up the entire time. Only when the voices go silent do you begin to hear the one voice that never stops speaking. And only when human love fails you do you finally understand the unfailing, scandalous grace of divine love. God did not step in merely to console you. He stepped in to elevate you, to lift you out of the pit they left you in and plant your feet on a foundation that will never shift. A foundation not built on people's promises, but on eternal truth. And what is that truth? That you are not defined by who abandoned you. You are not the sum total of who didn't show up. You are not worthless because they could not see your worth. Your value does not decrease when people are too blind to recognize it. You are not invisible just because they looked away. Their betrayal does not rewrite your identity. Their silence does not cancel your voice. Their absence does not determine your destiny. God stepped in, not just to heal, but to remind you of who you are when no one else cared to see. You are not too much. You are not too broken. You are not too late. You are exactly who God knew you would be, standing in the exact place where his grace could find you. And when he finds you, he doesn't fix you to send you back to those who hurt you. He restores you to reveal something greater through you. Something deeper than the rejection, something stronger than the sorrow, something that can only be forged in the fire and purified through pain. Because the truth is, the deepest pain often unlocks the highest purpose. That sleepless night you cried alone, it became the seedbed of empathy. That moment you were betrayed, it was the birthplace of resilience. Through that season, you were isolated. It became sacred ground for transformation. God stepped in, not as a second option, but as the only one, who could take what was meant for evil and turn it into the foundation of your destiny. And what he is doing in you now, though it may still be quiet, still invisible to others, is monumental in heaven's eyes. He is preparing a life not dependent on the approval of those who hurt you, a joy not attached to whether or not they ever apologize, a purpose not defined by the pain, but built upon it. And one day, you will look back, not in bitterness, but in awe, not at them, but at him, not because you finally got closure from them, but because you finally found completeness in him. You won't need their apology. You won't crave their return. You won't ache for their words anymore, because God's words will be louder, his presence stronger, his love deeper. They hurt you and left you when you needed them most, but that was the moment God stepped in and gave you everything they could never offer, and that is a gift beyond comprehension. There is something sacred about being stripped of every illusion. When the facades fall away and the people you once trusted walk out, you're left with a painful clarity, a revelation not just about them, but about yourself. And in that raw clarity, God begins his most beautiful work. Not when you are applauded, but when you are abandoned. Not when you are praised, but when you are pierced. For it is then that your soul becomes fertile ground for the truth he's been waiting to plant. You begin to realize that their absence didn't subtract from you, it revealed you. What you thought was the end of a chapter was in fact the first line of a new volume. And God, oh how gently he turns the page. He doesn't rush, he doesn't force, he lets you grieve, he lets you weep. He sits with you in the mess, and then when you're ready, he reminds you, this story is still mine to finish. And his stories never end in defeat. You see, when God becomes your everything, you begin to see everything differently. You no longer measure your worth by who stays. You no longer fear who leaves. You no longer build your peace on the fragile foundation of human consistency. Instead, you find your strength in the unshakable rock of God's presence. He becomes your confidence in rejection, your clarity in confusion, your comfort in loneliness, and most of all, your redemption in pain. They hurt you and walked away, thinking they'd broken you. But what they didn't understand is that breaking is not the end when God is involved, it's the beginning. The breaking made room for blessing. The tearing apart made space for something sacred to be sewn together in its place. And every piece of your heart that was shattered is now being held in divine hands, not just to be restored, but to be reborn. Because God is not interested in patchwork. He's not in the business of gluing you back together with fragile human glue. No, he rebuilds you with heavenly purpose. He doesn't just restore what you lost. He replaces it with something far greater. The love you lost, he gives you peace that doesn't require performance. The support you were denied, he anchors you with a strength that doesn't waver. The validation you craved, he covers you with the truth of your identity as his. And, here's the mystery, the more you draw near to him, the less you grieve those who left. Not because their absence didn't hurt, but because his presence now fills the space they could never truly occupy. You begin to thank him for the silence, for the solitude, for the sorrow, because it was there in that sacred stillness that you met the one who was never going to leave you. And as you begin to heal, not in haste but in holiness, you realize something even more profound. You have changed. You no longer look to others for your identity. You no longer beg to be understood. You no longer water deserts, hoping they will bloom. You walk differently now, with a quiet power, a sacred assurance, not prideful, not loud, but rooted, because when God becomes everything you need, you stop chasing people who made you feel like you were never enough. You stop bleeding for those who would not bandage you. You stop shrinking yourself to be digestible to those who were never meant to carry the weight of your soul. You hurt you and left you when you were weakest. But God stepped in, not to pity you, but to empower you. Not to temporarily comfort, but to eternally transform. And now you are not who you were before the pain. You are more. You are deeper. You are anchored, not because of them, but because of him. There comes a point in the journey where what once broke you no longer holds power over you, not because it didn't matter, not because it didn't hurt, but because something greater stepped in and redefined the experience, not as a curse, but as a catalyst. You begin to see with new eyes. Those who left you were never meant to carry you where you're going. Their exit was not a detour, it was direction. Their silence wasn't just absence, It was divine orchestration, and their betrayal wasn't the end. It was the beginning of a deeper reliance on the one who never betrays. You see, when God steps in, He doesn't always fix the situation. He fixes your sight. He adjusts your focus. He lifts your chin to see what you couldn't while your gaze was trapped in grief. And slowly, gently, He begins to show you what was hidden behind the heartbreak. He reveals the strength you didn't know you had. He uncovers the beauty buried beneath your bruises. He shines light into the shadows they left behind, and in doing so, He teaches you how to walk again. Not in fear, not in bitterness, but in holy boldness. Because when you've met God in your deepest pain, you stop living to avoid hurt. You start living to reflect healing. You no longer carry the burden of explaining your worth. You embody it. You no longer fight for their attention. You rest in God's affection. You no longer replay the moment they walked away. You rejoice in the day God walked in. And this is the miracle. He didn't just replace what they took. He rewrote the story. He didn't use ink. He used tears. He didn't write on paper. He wrote on your heart. And what He is scripting now isn't a comeback for their eyes to see. It's a becoming for heaven's purpose to fulfill. You are becoming someone who no longer needs the applause to feel approved. You are becoming someone who no longer fears the quiet because you've found God's voice within it. You are becoming someone who no longer begs for belonging because you've been adopted by the one who calls you His. They hurt you and left you, hoping you'd crumble. But God has taken those pieces and built something they could never destroy. He has made your pain your platform. He has made your rejection your redirection. He has made your loneliness the place where intimacy with Him was born. This is not weakness. This is worship. Every scar that still aches is now a mark of survival. Every moment you thought you wouldn't make it is now a testimony that you did. Not because you were strong, but because He was your strength. And now, when you walk, there's a light in your step. Not the light of pride, but the light of someone who has touched heaven in the depths of despair. Someone who knows what it's like to cry alone, but also what it's like to be held by the invisible arms of the Almighty. So let them wonder how you made it. Let them be confused by your peace. Let them whisper about your glow, because they don't know what happened in the wilderness. They don't know the nights you laid in silence while God whispered life back into your weary soul. They don't know how He comforted you when your mind was a battlefield, how He held you when your own thoughts betrayed you. Where do you think He has His tribe? Because He has His tribe, how He reminded you that even if the world forgot your name, heaven never did. They don't know that when they left, God arrived. And He didn't just arrive, He stayed. He stayed when the tears soaked your pillow. He stayed when the questions screamed louder than answers. He stayed when hope was just a flicker and faith was only a whisper. He stayed, and in staying He became everything they never could be. What happens to a heart that has been both wounded by man and healed by God? It becomes holy, not in the way the world recognizes holiness, but in the quiet, unshakable way that says, I have been through the fire, and yet I am not consumed. That kind of heart no longer seeks validation from fleeting voices. It no longer chases the echo of those who once mattered. It beats to a different rhythm now, the rhythm of eternity, the rhythm of grace, the rhythm of God's presence, which fills every space others abandon. And this is what makes the transformation so divine. Where the world saw your weakness, God planted wisdom. Where others found you too fragile, God found you fertile, ready to carry the seeds of a new story. And he's been writing that story ever since they left. Line by line, breath by breath, every sigh, every prayer, every moment you thought no one was watching, he saw it, he recorded it, he responded, not with noise, but with nearness, not with vengeance, but with vision, not with answers, but with presence, because he knew that what you needed most was not a resolution, but a resurrection, left you in a tomb of confusion. But God rolled the stone away, not so others would see you rise, but so you would finally see yourself as he does, not defeated, but destined. And it is from this place, from the ashes of what you thought was your ending, that your anointing begins to bloom. Yes, anointing, because make no mistake, what you've been through wasn't random, it wasn't meaningless, it wasn't in vain. Every tear you cried was watering the ground for something sacred. Every ache in your chest was loosening the soil of your soul so that something eternal could take root. God doesn't waste pain, he repurposes it. He takes betrayal and turns it into boldness. He takes abandonment and transforms it into authority. He takes what they meant for evil and, with holy hands, reshapes it into something they can never take credit for, your divine calling. You may not see it yet, you may still be walking with a limp from the wound, but rest assured, heaven is not silent. Heaven is orchestrating the very reversal of your sorrow, and soon the very place where you wept will become the place from which you speak with power. You'll speak to others who are exactly where you once were. You'll recognize the look in their eyes, the silent ache, the buried hope, and you'll say, I know what it feels like to be left. I know what it feels like to be forgotten, but let me tell you what happened when God stepped in. And they'll listen, not because you are perfect, not because you never broke, but because you carry something real, something raw, something that wasn't manufactured in comfort, but forged in the fire of divine intimacy. And that is what makes your healing unshakable. It wasn't handed to you by the world. It was carved into you by the God who refused to leave. It was etched in the middle of midnight, when no one else could see you falling apart but him, and it was finished in the quiet dawn, when the first light of his love touched your face and reminded you, you are not what they did to you, you are what I've declared over you. So walk forward, not waiting for them to return, but rejoicing that God never left. Lift your head, not to be seen by those who abandon you, but to behold the one who crowned you in your lowest place. And speak, not to defend your worth, but to declare his glory through your scars. Because now you know, they hurt you and left you when you needed them most, but God stepped in. And when he did, everything changed. There is a justice that man cannot give and time cannot create. It is the kind of justice that does not seek revenge but restoration. A holy justice, a justice that flows not from anger but from love so perfect that it sees beyond the surface and reaches into the very marrow of our suffering. This is the justice of God, not thunderbolts hurled from the heavens, but a quiet, sovereign turning of the tide. For every tear they caused you, God kept count. For every promise they broke, he wrote a better one over your life. For every moment you were overlooked, he was preparing a table for you, not in secrecy, but in the very presence of those who once saw your pain and looked away. This is not to shame them, it is to show you that God does not ignore wounds. He does not bypass betrayal. He does not shrug off your sorrow. He gathers it. And in his perfect timing, he does what no human can do. He redeems it. You see, redemption is not about returning to who you were before the hurt. It's about becoming who you were always meant to be because of it. Stronger, wiser, softer, not in weakness, but in grace. And that grace makes you dangerous to darkness, because now you know where your strength comes from, not from their acceptance, not from their understanding, but from the one who met you when all understanding failed and all acceptance was withdrawn. And the irony? What they did to break you became the very thing God used to build you. They thought they were subtracting from your life, but God added to you through every subtraction. They thought they were silencing you, but your silence became the soil of sacred growth. They thought they left you in ruins, but you are now standing on the ruins, not buried beneath them. You've stopped looking for them to come back. You've stopped rehearsing the scene of their exit because something more powerful has taken over. The awareness that you are not alone and never were. That kind of realization doesn't just change how you see yourself, it changes how you live. You no longer wait to be chosen. You walk as someone already chosen. You no longer strive to be loved. You rest as someone already beloved. You no longer seek permission to be whole. You carry wholeness with you, even if others only remember the version of you that bled. And here's what's most astounding. What you carry now is light. Not artificial light, not spotlight, but the kind of quiet, radiant light that doesn't need to prove anything. The kind that comes from being in the presence of the only one who saw everything and still said, "You are mine." They left you in your need, but God met you there. There withheld what you longed for, but God gave you what you didn't even know you needed. And what you needed was not another flawed human holding your heart. What you needed was divine hands. Strong, steady, scarred from love, cradling every broken part of you and saying, "This will become something beautiful." And so it has. Not because the world applauded, not because those who hurt you changed, but because God stepped in. And when God steps in, nothing remains the same. One day, when you look back, you won't do so with bitterness. You won't recount the story with trembling lips or tear-filled eyes. Instead, there will be a calm in your spirit, a softness in your heart, and a fire in your eyes that speaks of a journey walked with God, not around the pain, but through it. And in that reflection, you will not see what was lost. You will see, because the greatest gain was never their apology. It was God's presence. It was not the healing of the wound alone, but the rebirth of your identity through that wound. You no longer carry just the memory of their betrayal. You carry the imprint of God's rescue. You are living proof that divine love does not abandon in the valley. You are evidence that silence from others only amplifies the voice of heaven. You are the story of someone who was left in ruins, only to discover that God does his finest work with rubble. And now you live differently, not because you haven't known pain, but because pain became the very altar upon which God laid his healing hand. Now you speak with conviction, not the loud conviction of those who have never suffered, but the steady assurance of someone who has sat in darkness and discovered the light. You walk with peace, not the peace that comes from life being perfect, but the peace that comes from knowing that even in imperfection, God is still working, still writing, still redeeming. You love with wisdom, not the naive love that throws itself at anyone who smiles, but the fierce, discerning love that flows from someone who has been cherished by God when everyone else forgot. And above all, you hope, not the shallow hope of wishing things were different, but the deep hope that knows, even if nothing changes on the outside, God is still enough on the inside. That is what happens when God steps in. He becomes your peace when closure never comes. He becomes your strength when weakness tries to return. He becomes your joy when sorrow lingers longer than expected. He becomes your song in the silence they left behind. And now, the same God who stepped in when they walked out is the God who is stepping you into a new chapter, not one defined by hurt, but by healing, not one ruled by memory, but by mission, not one where you simply survive, but where you soar. So let them say what they will. Let them remember what they choose. Their version of the story is theirs to tell. But yours is sacred. Yours is etched in the heavens. Yours is sung by angels who watched you get up again when the world thought you'd stay down. And while they carry their guilt, you carry grace. While they wonder what happened to you, you walk in the truth of who happened to you. God happened. That same God who sits with the abandoned, speaks to the forgotten, speaks to the broken, and transforms pain into purpose. Sue, stand tall, not as someone untouched by hurt, but as someone transformed by holy hands. They hurt you and left you when you needed them most. But that was the moment God stepped in, not just as comfort, but as everything you ever needed. And that changes everything.